Welcome, class. Let's begin our discussion of Chapter 7 on learning. Well, how do we learn? An overview. How does learning happen other than through language and words? Well, we learn from experience. When we learn to predict events we already like or don't like by noticing other events or sensations that happen first. When our actions have consequences. When we watch people and watch what they do. Or we learn by association, when two stimuli, events, or sensations tend to occur together or in sequence. When actions become associated with pleasant or aversive results. When two pieces of information are linked. So let's look at this idea of associative learning by looking at classical and operant conditioning, and then examine somewhat cognitive learning. Classical conditioning is learning to link two stimuli in a way that helps us anticipate an event to which we have a reaction. And operant conditioning, changing behavior choices in response to consequences. We behave a certain way, there's a consequence to that behavior, and then our next behavior that we choose is going to be different based on the consequences to those previous behaviors. And then there's cognitive learning, acquiring new behaviors and information through observation and information rather than by direct experience. Now, operant and classical conditioning are different forms of associative learning. In classical conditioning, it involves respondent behavior, reflexive, automatic reactions such as fear or craving. These reactions to unconditioned stimuli, the US, become associated with a neutral, which later becomes conditioned, stimuli. In operant conditioning, it involves operant behavior, that is, chosen behaviors which operate on the environment. These behaviors become associated with consequences which punish, decrease, or reinforce, increase the operant behavior. There is a contrast in the process of conditioning. The experimental or neutral stimulus repeatedly precedes the respondent behavior and eventually triggers that behavior. In operant conditioning, the experimental consequent stimulus repeatedly follows the operant behavior and eventually punishes or reinforces that behavior. So let's look at an example. Associative learning, classical conditioning. How it works. After repeated exposure to two stimuli occurring in sequence, we associate those stimuli with each other. The result, our natural response to one stimulus now can be triggered by the new predictive stimulus. Lightning. Stimulus 2, hear thunder. Here, our response to thunder becomes associated with lightning. After repetition, the stimulus of seeing lightning causes a response in us, for example, to cover our ears to avoid sound. Operant conditioning. A child associates his response behavior with consequences. The child learns to repeat behaviors, saying please, which were followed by a desirable result, like a cookie. The child learns to avoid behaviors, yelling gimme, which were followed by undesirable results of scolding or loss of dessert. So we can see at the bottom, the response of being polite gives you a consequence of getting a treat. Therefore, in the future, the behavior of saying please is going to be greatly enhanced. Probability you'll see that more often than gimme. That means it has been reinforced. Now, a quick look at cognitive learning. This cognitive learning refers to acquiring new behaviors and information mentally rather than by direct experience. Cognitive learning occurs, one, by observing events and behavior of others, so by observing events and behavior of others, and two, by using language to acquire information about events experienced by others. Alright, so now that we have that general background, let's look at some specifics. First, starting off with classical conditioning. Topics to help you build your new associations about conditioning: classical versus operant conditioning, Pavlov's experiments, acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization and discrimination, and applications of classical conditioning. Here are some of the basics. First, we have the neutral stimulus, NS. In classical conditioning, a stimulus that elicits no response before conditioning. The unconditioned response, or the UR, in classical conditioning is an unlearned, naturally occurring response, such as salivation, to an unconditioned stimulus, such as food in the mouth. The unconditioned stimulus. In classical conditioning, a stimulus that unconditionally, naturally, and automatically triggers an unconditioned response. A conditioned response. In classical conditioning, a learned response to a previously neutral but now conditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus. In classical conditioning, an originally irrelevant stimulus that, after association with an unconditioned stimulus, comes to trigger a conditioned response. For 3 decades, Pavlov's research demonstrated associative learning, exploring 5 major conditioning processes of acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. So let's talk about Ivan Pavlov's dog. Now, Ivan Pavlov was doing work on the digestive system of dogs. He was a physiologist, and he accidentally, through serendipity, discovered one of the key processes of learning in animals and in human beings. While studying salivation in dogs, Pavlov found that salivation from eating food was eventually triggered by what should have been neutral stimuli, such as just seeing the food, seeing the dish, seeing the person who brought the food, just hearing the person's footsteps. So, before conditioning, we have the neutral stimulus, a stimulus which does not trigger a response. So, ringing the bell, the neutral stimulus, does not elicit a response from the dog. So, before conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus and the response. A stimulus which triggers a response naturally before and without any conditioning. The unconditioned stimulus, in this instance, yummy dog food. That's the US. The unconditioned response of the dog is to salivate. During conditioning, the bell or toad, the neutral stimulus, is repeatedly presented with the food. Which then will result in unconditioned response of the dog salivating because of the presence of the unconditioned stimulus, the dog food. After conditioning, the dog begins to salivate upon hearing the tone. The neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. And now the dog salivates. But now, because the dog is salivating to a conditioned stimulus, this response of the dog is called a conditioned response. So, did you follow the changes? The unconditioned response and the conditioned response are the same response, but triggered by different events. The difference is whether conditioning was necessary for the response to happen or not. The neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are the same stimulus. The difference is whether the stimulus triggers the conditioned response. Now let's find some examples. We have the US, UR, NSCS, and CR and the following. Again, it's the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So let's read through some of these. Your romantic partner always uses the same shampoo. Soon, the smell of that shampoo makes you feel happy. So, what normally makes you feel happy? Your romantic partner. So in this instance, your romantic partner would serve as the unconditioned stimulus. And the unconditioned response make you feel happy. So what's the neutral stimulus? What is being associated with the romantic partner? That's going to be the shampoo or the smell of the shampoo. So the smell of the shampoo at one point is a neutral stimulus. It's paired now with your romantic partner who causes you to be happy. So now, when you smell that shampoo, it makes you feel happy. So it's no longer a neutral stimulus. The shampoo is no longer neutral. It is now a conditioned stimulus, which brings about you feeling happy. Let's do one more. The door to your house squeaks loudly when you open it. Soon your dog begins wagging its tail when the door squeaks. Okay, what is the unconditioned stimulus here that causes some sort of elated response in that doggy? Well, it's going to be you, the master. And the master makes the doggy happy. So the unconditioned stimulus is the master. The unconditioned response is doggy's happy. Now, at one point or another, because the master's always going out and coming back, what will happen is the squeak becomes associated with the master. The squeak initially is a neutral stimulus. It doesn't make the dog feel any particular way. But once the squeak begins to get paired with the master returning home, the squeak by itself then takes on certain characteristics of the master. Therefore, when you hear the squeak, you get happy. So in this instance, the conditioned stimulus is the squeak, and the conditioned response is the happy. Okay, so now we've talked about some of the examples of classical conditioning. Let's talk about the process of conditioning. We first start off with acquisition. Acquisition refers to the initial stage of learning or conditioning. What gets acquired? The association between a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus is what gets acquired. How can we tell that acquisition has occurred? Well, the unconditioned response now gets triggered by a conditioned stimulus. Drooling now gets triggered by a bell. So a bell causes salivation. It normally shouldn't do that. So that is a sign that there has been some acquisition occurring. Timing. For the association to be acquired, the neutral stimulus needs to be repeatedly appear before the unconditioned stimulus, about a half a second before in most cases. The bell must come right before the food. You can see in the graph to the right, we have the strength of the conditioned response, weak to strong. We have time to the right, and we can see from this curve that the more trials of the NS plus the US occur together, the stronger the conditioning will occur. The strength of the conditioning response grows with conditioning. Then we have extinction. Extinction refers to the diminishing of a conditioned response if the unconditioned stimulus food, for example, stops appearing with the conditioned stimulus bell. The conditioned response decreases. So what we have here, during the acquisition phase, we have the NS and US being paired together, strengthening the acquisition. And then in the extinction phase, we just keep doing the bell, without reintroducing the food, for example. After a while, the bond between the conditioned stimulus and that unconditioned stimulus starts to break apart. And after a while, we have extinction. The CS no longer causes a response in the organism. After a conditioned response, salivation has been conditioned and then extinguished, which we saw in the previous slide. Following a rest period, presenting the tone alone might lead to a spontaneous recovery or a return of the conditioned response, despite the lack of further conditioning. So what we have here at the graph, we have the acquisition phase, NS plus US. Then we just do the CS a bunch of times alone so that we get extinction. The CS is no longer doing or triggering any type of response. And after we've done that, we pause for a while. Then we come back with the conditioned stimulus. Bam. And if there is a response in the organism, okay, the recovery of the conditioned response, we refer to that as spontaneous recovery. It's almost as if the organism at some level forgot that the behavior had been extinguished previously. All right? And so we see spontaneous recovery occur. If the CS tone is again presented repeatedly without the US, the CR becomes extinct again, and that's what this represents here. We are doing the CS alone again, and so we get back to extinction. Now, let's look at the following: generalization and discrimination. Please notice the narrow psychological definition here. Ivan Pavlov conditioned dogs to drool when rubbed. They then also drooled when scratched. This represents generalization, the tendency to have conditioned responses triggered by related stimuli. In this instance, more stuff makes you drool, as long as they are related stimuli to what you had been conditioned on. Ivan Pavlov conditioned dogs to drool at bells of a certain pitch. Slightly different pitches did not trigger drooling. This is discrimination, the learned ability to only respond to a specific stimuli, preventing generalization. In this instance, less stuff makes you drool. So what do we know about all the work that Ivan Pavlov did? He did set behaviorism up to be a major force for many decades, particularly in America. So this accidental discovery of this conditioned response was a very great thing to have occurred by accident for psychology. So let's look at his legacy. Ivan Pavlov's legacy. Insights about conditioning in general. It occurs in all creatures. It is related to biological drives and responses. Insights about science. Learning can be studied objectively by quantifying actions and isolating elements of behavior. And insights from specific applications. Substance abuse involves conditioned triggers, and these triggers, certain places and events, can be avoided or associated with due responses. Another key figure in the area of the early days of behaviorism was John B. Watson. John B. Watson in classical conditioning, playing with fear. A 9-month-old little Albert was not afraid of rats. John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner then clanged a steel bar every time a rat was presented to Albert. Albert acquired a fear of rats and generalized this fear to other soft and furry things. Watson prided himself in his ability to shape people's emotions. He later went into advertising. Of course, there are ethical concerns for any type of experiment close to this, what we see here. This experiment could not have been done in today's world with regard to our ethical guidelines. Much of this early research in psychology was completed without such guidelines being existed or even being discussed. Uh, Rosalie Rayner and Watson did have the opportunity to, quote, fix or at least unconditioned or deconditioned little Albert before they left. Before he left, they did not do that. So the idea here is that we did learn a lot from this experiment, even though it does have some major ethical challenges to it. So, classical conditioning summary. We have acquisition, or the initial stage, when one links the neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus so that the neutral stimulus begins triggering the conditioned response. We have extinction. Diminishing of a conditioned response occurs in classical conditioning when an unconditioned stimulus does not follow a conditioned stimulus. And then spontaneous recovery, the reappearance after a pause of an extinguished response. Now let's look at operant conditioning, examine the basics. So, Skinner's experiments on shaping behavior, types of reinforcer, positive and negative, primary condition, immediate, delayed, reinforcement schedules, fixed and variable, interval, and ratios. So these are a variety of types of things, as well as punishment, that we will be seeing as we go through this material. Operant conditioning. Operant conditioning involves adjusting to the consequences of our behaviors. We may smile more at work after this repeatedly gets us bigger tips. We learn how to ride a bike using the strategies that don't make us crash. How it works: an act of chosen behavior, a response, is followed by a reward or punitive feedback from the environment. Result: reinforced behavior is more likely to be tried again. Punished behavior is less likely to be chosen in the future. So, as we see at the bottom here, the animal balancing a ball, the consequence for balancing the ball is receiving food. Therefore, balancing ball behavior has been strengthened in this animal, reinforced. Now let's look at Thorndike's law of effect. Edward Thorndike placed cats in what he called a puzzle box. They were rewarded with food and freedom when they solved the puzzle to get out. Thorndike noted that cats took less time to escape after repeated trials and rewards. So Thorndike came up with his law of effect. It reads, behaviors followed by favorable consequences become more likely, and behaviors followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely. It's a very simple idea, but the way psychology and research works, these simple and profound ideas, someone needs to state them. Then we have B.F. Skinner and behavioral control. Skinner saw great potential for exploring and using Edward Thorndike's principles much more broadly. He wondered How can we more carefully measure the effect of consequences on chosen behavior? What else can creatures be taught by controlling consequences? What happens when we change the timing of reinforcement? So these were some fundamental questions that B.F. Skinner spent a lot of his career trying to address. B.F. Skinner developed the operant chamber. Like Pavlov, he pioneered more controlled methods of studying conditioning. The operant chamber, often called the Skinner box, allowed detailed tracking of rates of behavior change in response to different rates of reinforcement. So what we have here is an example of a Skinner box. We have the rat's little paw on the bar that you press, light for stimuli, water and a food dispenser, and for audio sound we have a speaker. So the bar of the lever the animal presses randomly at first, later for reward, the food and water dispenser to provide the rewards, and the recording device. So by putting an animal in this Skinner, the operant chamber, or the Skinner box, they're able to track their responses as they relate to reinforcers or rewards. So let's look at operant conditioning reinforcement. Reinforcement, feedback from the environment that makes a behavior more likely to be done again. Positive reinforcement, the reward is adding something desirable. Negative reinforcement, the reward is ending something unpleasant. The meerkat has just completed a task out in the cold. For the meerkat, this warm light is quite desirable. Alright, ways to increase behavior. We have operant conditioning term over here, positive and negative reinforcement, and the description and example. Let's go through them quickly. So in operant conditioning, we have positive reinforcement. That means you add a desirable stimulus. For example, you pet a dog that comes when you call it. So the petting is desirable for the dog. Pet a dog that comes when you call it, you pet it. Or pay someone for work done. So they do some work, let's say rake your yard, then you give them some money. So here, the positive reinforcement, the positive is about adding something, and what we're adding is a desirable stimulus for the organism. Negative reinforcement, we remove an aversive stimulus. For example, we have a very, very bad headache. We take painkillers to end the pain. The behavior that's going to be going up is the likelihood that we'll take pain medicine in the future, because that's the behavior that was necessary for you to remove the aversive stimulus, the headache. You fasten your seatbelt to end the loud beeping in your car. In order to end the loud beeping, you have to do something, do that, whatever that is to end that loud beeping that you do is going to be the thing that gets reinforced. Seat belting behavior gets reinforced, and then it helps to take away those annoying sounds the car makes. Now, another idea is something called shaping behavior, or reinforcing successive approximations. Shaping, guiding a creature toward the behavior by rewarding that behavior that comes closer and closer to the desired behavior. For example, the little urban legend here of shaping the teacher. Students could smile and nod more when the instructor moves left until the instructor stays pinned to the left wall. Also, we have such thing as something called the cycle of mutual reinforcement. Children who have a temper tantrum when they are frustrated may get positively reinforced for this behavior when parents occasionally respond by giving in to the child's demands. Result, stronger, more frequent tantrums. So that's one of the reasons why you hear some parents talk about not picking your baby up all the time if it's crying or being really, really fussy, because that may reinforce it. So this is basically the same premise, that if the child has a temper tantrum and you give in and go to the child, for example, the results are usually going to be stronger, more frequent tantrums in the future because you just positively reinforce the kid. Parents who occasionally give in to tantrums may get negatively reinforced when the child responds by ending the tantrum. So the kid is in a situation where it's going to get positive reinforcement, something that it likes, and the parent is going to get negative reinforcement because it's going to get something taken away that it doesn't like, the crying. So the results ultimately, parents giving in behavior is strengthened, given in sooner and more often. Then we have discrimination, the ability to become more and more specific in what situations trigger a response. Shaping can increase discrimination if reinforcement only comes for certain discriminative stimuli. For example, dogs, rats, and even spiders can be trained to search for very specific smells, from drugs to explosives. Pigeons, seals, and manatees have been trained to respond to specific shapes, colors, and categories. So, why we might work for money? Well, if we repeatedly introduced a neutral stimulus before a reinforcer, this stimulus acquires the power to be used as a reinforcer. A primary reinforcer is a stimulus that meets a basic need or otherwise is intrinsically desirable, such as food, sex, fun, attention, or power. A secondary or conditioned reinforcer is a stimulus such as a rectangle of paper with numbers on it, aka money, which has become associated with a primary reinforcer, money, buys food, builds power. Upper conditioning, looking at reinforcement schedules. First, the human talent of responding to delayed reinforcers. Dogs learn from immediate reinforcement. A treat 5 minutes after a trick won't reinforce the trick. Humans have the ability to link a consequence to a behavior even if they aren't linked sequentially in time. A piece of paper, a paycheck, can be delayed reinforcer, paid a month later if we link it to our performance. Delaying gratification is a skill related to impulse control, and it enables longer-term goal setting. So how often should we reinforce? Again, this is one of the questions that B.F. Skinner came up with a long time ago. Do we need to give a reward every single time, or is that even best? B.F. Skinner experimented with the effects of giving reinforcements and different patterns or schedules to determine what worked best to establish and maintain a target behavior. In continuous reinforcement, given a reward after the target every single time, the subject acquires the desired behavior quickly. In partial or intermittent reinforcement, giving rewards part of the time, the target behavior takes longer to be acquired or established, but persists longer without reward. So let's look at some of these different schedules of partial or intermittent reinforcement. Let me note one thing before I move on here. When we have continuous reinforcement, one of the things about that is this. If you get reinforced every single time you do a behavior, that first time you do the behavior you don't get reinforced, you know the reinforcement has ended. You have a clue. And usually that behavior will end soon after. But in partial or intermittent reinforcement, the thing about it is you don't expect it every single time. So you may be able to go long periods of time not knowing that you're not getting reinforced because you don't expect it every single time. There's a little bit of power in that. That is why when we have intermittent or partial reinforcement schedules, they tend to be a lot more resistant to extinction. Unlike continuous reinforcement. If you're getting reinforced continuously based on a behavior, you know when the reinforcement stops. You, you say, I did it, you want your consequence, no consequence, you know it, and therefore the behavior changes much more rapidly. Alright, so getting back to the different schedules of partial or intermittent reinforcement. We may schedule our reinforcements based on an interval of time that goes by. For example, fixed interval, every so often, or variable interval schedule, unpredictably often. We may plan for a certain ratio of rewards per number of instances of the desired behavior. So we may have a fixed ratio schedule, every so many behaviors rewarded, or a variable ratio schedule. After an unpredictable number of behaviors, you are rewarded.